Welcome to lectures and interviews about leadership for sustainability. I'm Bruce Hull. I want to talk about what I call the pristine myth. It's a tendency of us to use words like authentic, original, wild, or even scientific sounding words like the natural range of variability to denote some condition of nature that supposedly should be privileged or conserved or preserved. Most of my comments will be focused on North America, but the logic applies to the impact of Aboriginal peoples on continents everywhere. Here's a list of some of the evidence I want to go over with you. I'm going to begin by talking about evidence from explorers, and then we'll come back and talk about some evidence from archaeology. Sometime around 1539, in what is now Tampa Bay, Florida, the conquistador Hernando DeSoto landed with his ships, disembarked, brought cows and pigs and horses and a bunch of conquistadors. He burned the ship so no one would be tempted to leave, and started exploring, looking for fame and fortune. And one of his hopes, I think, was to find a port city where there were tidal flows, which meant he could trade with the West and be a connection between the East and the West and get rich and famous that way. He explored all this territory. Many of his colleagues died. He died somewhere around the Mississippi, was buried in the Mississippi. The point of this story is that only a few people walked out. They walked out through Mexico, and they took the journals with them, and that's how we know what people saw along the way. And they found that the conquistadors rarely left a trail. They stayed in villages. They provisioned themselves from the fields of corn and squash. They found a very civilized, a very populated, a very peopled, a very cultured continent. Other explorers whose names you'll recognize, like Lewis and Clark and Cortez, all found fabulously rich and detailed civilizations as they explored the wilderness. Now, there's lots of other evidence that I want to review with you. And just begin by talking about the number of people that were supposedly in the Americas. Somewhere between 40 and 100 million. 100 million people in the Americas. This is prior to Columbus. Maybe only 10 million or so in North America, so most of the people were in Central and South America. They changed the environment in many ways. Let's talk about some. Fire was used extensively to control insects, to improve hunting, to clear vegetation so you could see advancing war parties and better defend your tribe, to grow oaks and berries and other sources of food. The use of fire changed the landscape tremendously, releasing so much carbon into the atmosphere that some even think it affected the climate before fossil fuels. So it's an immense amount of fire. It certainly changed the species habitat. Many species today, like oaks and others, are fire tolerant, and they're struggling to survive because we no longer burn as much as Native Americans. Sadly, species extinction is another defining character of human habitation. This one applies to just about every continent. When humans arrived, the large, slow, protein-filled animals died. They were hunted to extinction. Agriculture may be humanity's biggest impact on the rest of the biosphere, not just the domestication of crops of corn and tomatoes and other species, but the transformation of the landscape, the burning of the forest, the clearing of the land is just creating a whole new habitat for species that we ate, that we want. It's just a dramatic replacement of biodiversity. The intensity and extent of Aboriginal cultures is impressive. Here's the Cahokia civilization, which is near St. Louis, U.S. This culture had more people living in it at 1000 AD than were living in London, England. It had trade routes that stretched from the Gulf of Mexico all the way to the Great Lakes, and from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast. It had extensive and highly developed agriculture and religion and other ceremonies. It had mounds that rivaled the Great Pyramids. That's right, the size of the mounds made out of soil were larger than the Great Pyramids of Egypt. My purpose here is neither to critique nor idealize the impacts of Aboriginals. It's just to point out that they were many and they were extensive. What's more interesting, and certainly more relevant to this lecture, are the implications of all these impacts. It means we can't use words like authentic or 1491 or wild or pristine without realizing that there's a great deal of ambiguity. What are the conditions that we want when we say we want something to be pristine or original or natural range? Sometimes there's an assumption that these conditions are associated with ecological health or ecological integrity or some scientific characterization. But as we see in the next section, that's also a myth. Often it's just an aesthetic that we think we want because we've been brought up with Disney films and other kinds of cultural norms to think that conditions existing before modern people started using the land, that somehow that condition is better. It's pristine. And that is just a myth. Or worse, it's an attempt to confuse and deflect the discussion and hide one's real values and motivations for arguing for one condition over another. We'll continue this discussion when we talk about balanced nature in the next section.